Here's an idea. Let's not get crazy.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Excited for another episode of Sensible Psychedelics. For those who have seen some of the previous episodes, as you probably know, we're writing a book, or rather, we have written a book, Karen and I, which we hope to have published by mid-June, about the psychedelic movement and some of the things that we have seen in the culture that we find problematic, and that we hope to remedy through the publication of this book and by creating a community of people that we'll call center or right of center culturally, that currently don't have a place to hang their hat within the psychedelic movement. And
we are not invited to the party.
They're right, that we are not invited to the party. In fact, we wrote a Substack about that, and we'll put that in the notes here in the what are they called, production notes? I'm learning all of this podcast lingo as we go along here.
Good.
We'll put it in the notes, the link to Sensible Psychedelics Substack, and we recently wrote an article about why center right and center people have essentially not been invited to this party historically. And so as we started talking about this and doing some research, we came up with some interesting survey results, which we think might provide some understanding, bring some light to this phenomenon. And so with that, we'll start in given our technical skills here, we hope to be able to put these charts up on the podcast so that you'll be looking at them at the same time that we are looking at them. But I think we're going to start with the first chart is really just a breakdown of the liberal Democrat, conservative Republican divide, moderate independent, a lot of ways to kind of categorize how people sit culturally and politically. There's obviously overlap. And I think it was Mark Twain who said there are lies, damn lies, and then there are statistics. And so some of these statistics might appear a little bit surprising to you all. They were surprising to us as well, some of them. But I think some of them will illuminate this question of why the culture is so predominantly left of center and why there are so few center, right of center people in the movement currently. So this first chart that we're going to look at is the breakdown of the political composition of the country as a whole. And in the last YouGov 2023 survey, they essentially estimated that the breakdown's relatively equal. You have about 32 to 35% identify themselves as conservative Republican. About 28% identify themselves as liberal Democrat, and then the remainder, about 35% or so, as moderate independent. What we found interesting about this particular chart is among lifetime psychedelic users, it was broken down almost evenly between Democrat, Republican, and independent. And we think the main reason for that is that a lot of conservatives will have experimented with psychedelics in college, and that's probably why that number looks equivalent to the number of people who've taken psychedelics that identify as liberal Democrats. But we're guessing that those who are consistently using psychedelics or frequently using psychedelics, that number of Republican conservatives is probably quite a bit smaller.
I'd be curious about the question if it was historical use. I guess it is lifetime psychedelic users. That makes sense. But I have to say, it also makes sense to me that there are underground Republican or conservative users of psychedelics, simply from what I hear in the conservative therapist Facebook groups, where people private message me and say, I've been doing this for years. I don't feel like I can tell other therapists, because I think we're looking at the self-censoring of conservatives in the liberal psychedelic movement, and also self-censoring of conservatives in the conservative groups. So I think this number is surprising to me, because I think more people are doing it than are saying it
that are saying it.
presently. So not
Eh,
just college use as well.
No, that's
That's my
actually a good
suspicion.
point. I hadn't thought about that. That's my personal experience because
Mm,
uh, no one in my previous profession, my job, knew that I had taken psychedelics, and I wasn't about
yeah.
to tell them.
Yeah.
Just because of a reputational risk associated with that. And so I
Yeah.
bet you're right. I bet you there are a lot of people that have, especially cannabis, right? Even though cannabis is not
Mhm.
technically a psychedelic, I'm
Mhm.
guessing there are quite a few Republican conservative people that take cannabis on a frequent basis and don't talk about it, don't mention it.
And
Whereas
I'm
versus the
I'm
liberals probably say it as a badge of honor, like, yeah, I went to a psychedelic
yeah.
retreat. I'm on the cutting
Yeah.
edge.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, I'm now have infiltrated the conservative landscape, and that I'm living in a very conservative part of Texas. And it is so, I'm learning so much because I was just speaking with someone, incidentally, randomly the other day, who was saying, she was a nurse, and she said, oh, I never really believed in mental health. And then just recently, she started to consider, oh, maybe, what happens to people in their history really affects them. And I thought, oh my gosh, I forgot, coming from the progressively liberal left now to center and maybe even a little right of center, is that mental health wasn't even a concept that could be acknowledged or believed in, like she said. So
Yeah.
people who are using psychedelics for their mental health or for spiritual awakening or whatever they're doing to be closer to their faith or God are definitely not going to say anything to their conservative friends if they don't even believe in mental health.
If they don't, yeah, yeah. No, as a conservative, mental health, I equate that to up until recently, whiners, right? Like, get your act
Yeah.
together. Just like,
Yeah.
pull yourself up by your bootstraps. As my
Hmm.
mom and dad would always tell me, stop whining, get out and mow the lawn. Um,
Yeah.
and of course, there is some truth to that, right? There's
Hmm.
always truth.
Hmm.
There's some truth to that. I think Abigail Schreier points that out in her book.
Hmm.
Why our kids aren't growing up. But you're absolutely right. I think there's a bias in the conservative movement against therapy, against this idea of people creating their own problems, and they just need to kind of step back from that and
Yeah.
get to work. And that's very much a conservative cultural phenomenon that I think keeps people from admitting it, right? From
Yeah.
admitting that
Yeah.
they're going to a therapist or
And here we are asking people to consider not only speaking up about their use or speaking up to be part of the conversation around how this moves through our culture, but speaking up to liberals about it. So
yeah,
it's a big ask in a lot of ways. As I
yeah,
look at these numbers, I'm heartened, but I'm also thinking, wow, that's and it's going to be an interesting ask for us through our book. Hopefully, we will help people see how important it is, conservatives and free thinking normies, to join their voices into the movement. Because when we look at this lower part of the chart, political journalists, the gatekeepers, look at that number. I mean, what is that's
yeah.
80% liberal.
Yeah, it's rather shock. Yeah, and for those who are just
Yeah.
listening to the audio,
Yeah.
this is a chart that essentially shows roughly equal proportions of people within the liberal Democrat camp, the moderate independent, and the conservative Republican camp having taken psychedelics and the baseline political affiliation. But then when you get down to like surveys on political journalists, roughly 80% describe themselves as liberal Democrat. Only 7%, 6 to 7% describe themselves as conservatives. And then among psychedelic advocate, what we're calling the psychedelic advocacy class, which are essentially those people who are the stakeholders that are making decisions in the movement. They're the ones that set the agenda at MAPS. They're the ones that set the agenda generally within the psychedelic community. They're the ones that are posting the influencers in the psychedelic community. 80% of them identify as liberal Democrat, only 6 to
Hmm.
7% identify as conservative. And so there's this real disconnect. And this to me, this particular graph explains why conservatives haven't been invited to the party. Because if your party coordinator or organizer doesn't know who you are, just insinuating, giving
Hmm.
them the benefit of the doubt, If they don't know who you are, they're not going to invite you to the party.
Yeah, they don't have
And
your address.
they don't have your address. Exactly. Exactly. And so that's why you haven't been invited to this party. Now, there are those
Yeah.
who intentionally want to exclude people that
Yes.
are on the conservative side until they genuflect at the altar of, critical theory and
Yeah.
acknowledge their white privilege or whatever privilege they might have.
Mhm.
But I'd say the bulk of those people, and we'll come back to this with the Michael Pollan comment, but the bulk of those people, I think, are just not realizing that there are those others out there.
Yeah, and I mean, it reminds me of my experience at the psychedelic conference, the MAPS psychedelic conference in 2023, where after the audience booed Rick Perry and flooded out, and I was so stunned. I started interviewing people that I met randomly and all along in different classes over the next 3 days in the psychedelic tea lounge even, and talked with them about how did they feel about that moment. And most of them, in fact, 99.9% of the people I talked to were more moderate than I expected them to be. So I think there is a huge piece of self-censoring happening as I'm talking about this on the liberal side as well. Because I mean, speaking as a therapist, for years we've felt so threatened by other therapists that we can't speak up with fear of cancellation or licensure report. If you don't adhere to the ideology, if you question it at all, you're canceled. So there might be some self-censoring too. Well, I don't think there might be. There is self-censoring happening on the liberal side as well.
Yeah, let's come back to that point because
Yeah.
I find that very interesting in the context of how people identify themselves, but how much of that identification is perhaps being driven by perceptions that they have
Mm,
about themselves and the risk that they feel um, if they were to announce that they are a certain category, given the fact that you have this very militant, what we're calling in the book, the authoritarian left,
mhm.
not liberal, right? And we really want to distinguish that
Yeah.
because within our broader tent that we're creating, we invite liberals, right? We just
Yeah.
did the authoritarian aspects of the left and the right are not welcome because we're tolerant of everything except intolerance, right? And that's the only thing that we're intolerant about is intolerance. I know there's a contradiction there, but let's jump to this next chart, which you
Yeah.
love, I think, which is the ideological composition of mental health professionals.
Mm,
So our baseline is the same, right? Generally equal part people conservative, moderate, liberal across the political spectrum.
mhm.
But mental health professionals, 70% identify as liberal. Only
Yeah, and I would
6% as
definitely say that's low. I mean, I
okay.
at
Explain
least for,
why.
yeah, well, for the vocal majority, the very loud vocal majority. I just want to point out this is 2024, so this is later than the chart we just looked at.
Mhm.
This is a Gallup poll, which I assume has a higher sample population. And the conservative numbers are a little bit bigger, it seems like. The liberal numbers are slightly smaller. Maybe it's actually the moderates that are a little bit bigger. So I find that interesting. Um,
So do you think that there are people in that independent camp that do not that actually are conservative, small c conservative, and we just wrote a Substack
mm,
explaining what we mean by conservative. We're going to have a whole podcast just on what we mean by conservative. But do you think that there are people in that gray, and that looks like probably about 25% that are independent or moderate? Do you think that any of them are small c conservative, but they're afraid to identify themselves as such because of reputational risk?
yes, and licensing risk. I mean, there are so many, there are ethical quandaries that therapists get put into by their state, the conflict between the APA, so the American Psychological Association, the American Counseling Association, those codes of ethics, which are very wrapped around social justice, and state laws. And so we're always having to navigate the person, the human in front of us, our training and how we treat that person. And then if we talk about that in groups, how we advertise ourselves on websites. I've just come out on my website and said, I have criteria for supervisees. And those criteria include somewhat charged statements like I need them to not have a social justice perspective, but to be more interested in classical psychology and value the history of psychology, things like that. I would not have done that 3 years ago because of the coming from the Pacific Northwest, the kind of threats and reports to my licensing board, reputational things I had to do to navigate. The voices are so loud and so angry and so vitriolic that there really is a lot of self-censoring happening. So it's a very fraught landscape for mental health professionals, and I would also suspect that the big 70% of mental health professionals that are liberal are like me, who have hold liberal values, but not authoritarian liberal values. But we couldn't easily call ourselves conservative because we've been indoctrinated into loathing conservatives and we can't loathe ourselves. So there's a double bind there. So
Hmm.
I think there's a lot more nuance in that particular delineation
So among
than we're.
it's on this
Mhm.
particular bar, this
Yeah,
horizontal bar on this particular chart or graph, mental health professionals,
yeah,
70% identify as liberal. Of that group, what you're in this space, so and I know this is just going to be driven by your personal experience, not by statistics, but what
mm,
percentage of healthcare professionals do you feel are the social justice warriors? Because obviously, could you
yeah,
distinguish between a liberal therapist and a
sure.
social justice therapist?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about is the year that they graduated, because what we're really talking about here is education and the capture of that system. I think those of us that graduated maybe 2009 and prior did not receive a social justice education. 2010 and later, I think, did receive a social justice. And it was starting and then really in full force in 2014, 15. And the data is out there um, by other social scientists that really talk about this. But I think what we're talking about is therapists that have been taught that advocacy is their job and not intrapersonal reflection and guidance. And this is my main platform soapbox, is that the way that psychedelics are coming through finally in a valid supported way by the government and the FDA is through veterans. And the majority of veterans skew conservative. And if the majority of therapists that are trained in psychedelic work skew authoritarian left, then we have a mismatch and clients could really suffer from that. And so that's why I'm so passionate about talking about this and why we need conservative or, as you call them, small c conservative or moderate therapists in the psychedelic work in particular for the clients.
So in your so just to I want to repeat back to you so that I'm clear on this. So a therapist who holds liberal views but adheres to traditional forms of
Mm,
psychotherapy
mm,
could be a good therapist for a veteran with PTSD,
yeah.
but a social justice warrior won't be because they're not willing to meet that client where they are. Is that,
Well,
am I describing
yes,
that
because
accurately?
yeah, because that would be called clinical neutrality, which is now taught as harmful, because what therapists are being taught to do is to call it's something called broaching. So social justice therapists position themselves as the expert, ironically, in an oppressor oppressed narrative and the invisible systemic injustice forces that happen. So they're looking at a client through a lens of identity within this oppressor oppressed model. So they're actively taught. I mean, I've met with grad students, I've read the NCMHCE. They are actively taught to um, teach and dislike and guide the MAGA Republican, the conservative client to a more liberal worldview. So
Okay.
that they're not a good match and even harmful if they can't support the client where they are, especially in such a vulnerable state as a psychedelic state.
Okay, so let me bring that comment back to the
Hmm.
topic of our podcast,
Hmm.
which I think is relevant, which is, why why center right people haven't been invited to this party. So if you have a
Yeah.
combination of, as we've described before, you have two cultures within the psychedelic movement currently. You've got the what I'll call the woo-woo culture, and you've got the medical culture.
Mm-hmm.
Within the medical culture, that's where all the therapists reside, right? That's where all the psychotherapists and the mental health professionals reside. Is that accurate?
Maybe, I mean, really depending on your framework. Because I
Okay.
think we're just figuring this out as we explore this world. Is there's the woo woo, which is the sort of not Christian but New Age, hippie culture, crystals, yoga, all of that.
Right.
Um,
Some of it
and there's
charming
the
and harmless, and
yes,
some of it
sure,
actually helpful. Some of it helpful,
yes,
but some of it not.
absolutely, yeah,
Right. Some of it not
absolutely.
helpful. So
And so, but within the woo woo culture, there's the social justice crowd, I think.
right.
And also within the medical culture, there's social justice crowd. So it kind
Okay.
of
Good.
infiltrates in both of those.
That's what I was trying to suss out that I didn't do a very good job
Yeah.
of. You did perfect. Okay. So so it's what's interesting about that is that when you have mental health professionals predominantly left of center, and you have woo woo culture people predominantly left of center,
Yeah.
and then within the stakeholders, the advocacy, those who promote psychedelics and are at the forefront of the promotion of psychedelics, by and large left of center. It's no wonder, even even assuming good faith on the part of everyone in that left of center culture, it's no wonder that conservatives haven't been invited to the party, because I think in a lot of ways, um, and maybe this comes back to the Michael Pollan story. Well, before I go to Michael Pollan, what's interesting about the medical and the woo woo is that, and we've mentioned this before, for every one person who goes to a psychedelic assisted therapy, clinical,
Hmm.
formal session, there are 100 people engaging in
Hmm.
psychedelic sessions that are DIY, do it yourself, or in
Hmm.
the underground, right? Medicine women,
Hmm.
facilitators, guides, coaches.
Hmm.
That's the
Hmm.
unregulated part of the industry. But I would guess that even in that, in the unregulated side, there's probably an equal number. It's probably just as much of a distorted,
Mm.
um, or
Skewed.
disproportionate left of center, skewed
Hmm.
left of center.
Yeah.
Now, I would think within the coaching industry, it's probably not as radically social justice or authoritarian left
Hmm.
as it is with the therapeutic, only because there are not institutions that the authoritarian left was able to go in and take over, because coaching
Yeah.
is a free market. You don't have
Yeah.
to get certified. But they
Hmm.
did according to you, they did, and according to what I've read within the
Hmm.
therapeutic community, that's exactly what they did starting in around
Yeah.
2010.
Yeah. Yeah. The social sciences in general.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I guess the question for us is, knowing this data and knowing my experience, your experience of self-censorship, how do we help conservatives and free-thinking people that are not aligned with the authoritarian left? How do we invite them to the party and open the door and say, you are welcome? I think this is our attempt,
Yeah.
is saying, hey, you are welcome. There are people like you here.
Yeah, yeah. I think at the outset, it's to send out the message that there are more people that are like you in the movement
Yeah,
today than you know. And
yeah,
you wouldn't know that from the articles you read. You wouldn't know that from the protesters that break up psychedelic conferences and speak. You wouldn't know that from the loudest voices in the movement.
yeah,
But they're there. They're
yeah.
there, and
We're
they've
here.
been, yeah, we're here. Yeah, yeah, we're here.
Hmm.
And we've been largely silent, largely deferential to that predominant
Hmm.
culture. But in doing so, it's been hard for us to kind of, you know, connect with each other, compare notes,
Yeah,
find community.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think Sensible Psychedelics is a great name because we're trying to add this common sense perspective into what looks more and more like an increasingly polarized psychedelic community.
Yeah. And very much with an open invitation for anyone.
Yeah.
with that is interested in evidence, interested in spirituality, interested
Mm-hmm.
in open and frank discussion and dialogue. We're
Mm-hmm.
very pro heterodox in our orientation. Um, I'd like to the on this final chart, the where we on
Yeah.
both charts where we show the psychedelic advocacy class, which
Mm.
we're estimating at around 80% left of center, and about 7 to 8% what you'd call right of center, with that 10 to 15% being in the middle, independent. Uh, I want to go back to Michael Pollan's
Mm.
recent tweet, and I just wrote an
Yeah.
open letter to him. I'm sure he'll read it. An open letter to him of like, what the hell? Like, you're
Yeah.
killing me here, because
Yeah.
I want to say at the outset, and I said this in the post, I love Michael Pollan's work. He's a literary genius. He's probably the most literary journalist that I've ever read. Just the way he brings
Mm.
things to life. Um, he's done more as a journalist, as a thought leader in this psychedelic space than perhaps even Rick Doblin himself, in terms of
Mm.
bringing it into the mainstream.
Yeah.
And I've always known him to be left of center politically, but that's fine, right? I mean, people need
Mm.
to have
Mm-hmm.
their views politically based on their values. But when he tweeted that the main headline, I don't know, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but I think he said, the Trump administration's executive order, the main headline was Trump trying to bring Joe Rogan back into the political fold, and how
Yeah.
low Trump could go politically. This is like the lowest thing that Trump could do politically. Well, first off, I'm no Trump fan,
Yeah.
but I don't have Trump derangement syndrome either, but I'm no Trump
Yeah.
fan. But of all the things that I would think this is the lowest thing he could do, this wouldn't be it. Because,
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
what,
Right.
making a political mover to bring someone back into your
Yeah.
movement? I mean, everybody does that. That's the
Yeah.
nature of politics. So that was kind of odd
Yeah.
in and of itself. But also I thought, here is a guy who's got an
Mm.
incredible platform and
Yeah.
now has the ability, with his incredible skills as a writer, to reach out and
Mm-hmm.
relate and be relatable to 77 million people who voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And instead, he probably pissed off half of those 77
Yeah.
million people by making
Yeah.
that comment, which just seemed like a cheap shot. It just,
Yeah.
instead of saying this is a monumental moment in the
It
history of
was,
psychedelics, of modern
yeah,
psychedelics,
and
it was
celebrating that.
odd.
Yeah, like transcending the political nature of that
Yeah.
and
And just like,
yeah.
and just,
Hmm.
just saying, just giving kudos for the executive order for what it was
Yeah.
worth, which
Yeah.
was changing what neither Republican nor Democratic presidents have been willing to do since the
Hmm.
war on drugs began in
Yeah.
1970 and the Controlled
Yeah.
Substances Act was passed, which put all these psychedelics into that Schedule one category.
Hmm.
But giving him the benefit of the doubt, because I've listened to him speak enough to think that I think he's a very compassionate person, a very thoughtful person. When I look at this chart and I see that 6% of Republicans, it dawns on me, he's left of center politically. He's in that 80%. I don't even think he knows those
Yeah.
Republicans exist. I just don't think that he sees them in very two-dimensional
Hmm.
shapes, and he
Hmm.
doesn't see them as possible candidates for psychedelics.
Hmm.
Maybe potentially irredeemable. I don't know, but I don't think that I think more than anything, he just doesn't have people in his network. When
Right.
he was writing that tweet, I don't think he was thinking, this is going to piss off a lot of my friends. Because I'm
Yeah.
guessing most of his friends were not pissed off by that tweet. They
Right.
were probably
Right.
like, kudos, way to,
Yeah.
way to, way to, shot across the bow for our
Yeah.
cause. But
Right.
I think it was very counterproductive
And short-sighted, really.
and short-sighted. Yeah.
And
I think that's,
maybe this is my suicidal empathy, or maybe it's my actual empathy, but I just keep thinking of the clients. Like for me, this is all about the clients to be served. And the clients that are going to be served, we're watching Louisiana, Oklahoma, another state, I can't remember, actually pass bills saying, yes, psychedelic research is going to happen. Um, and it's going to happen with the most wounded, probably in the VA, PTSD, people that are suffering the most. And if it's veterans, then they are they're mainly conservative people. And so, how do the veterans feel that are using the medicine or going to receive these treatments and hearing this denigration of it? It gives a mixed message, and it just doesn't give great care for the clients, which is the whole reason that it's coming into fruition right now.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very interesting time. You're making me think of a really interesting podcast we should do sometime on tribalism and
Mm,
how psychedelics don't keep you from being tribal, because they
yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
They don't.
Yes, that's a great
Um,
example. His TDS in some ways, um, or his need to make that political
yeah,
is really that tribalism need.
yeah,
Tribalism, and then the antidote, like how to not self-censor, speaking up.
yeah,
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation because I think data is really interesting to try to get a feel for what's happening out there, and also who we need to invite in and how we need to talk to them. So I'm glad that you brought these up.
yeah. No, so yeah, absolutely. And we'll put in the notes as soon as we figure out how to do this, because I'm kind of I'm wearing a lot of hats right now as we put out content. We're trying to get, but we'll put in the notes a link to our landing page to our book that currently has a working title. We're calling it sensible-psychedelicsbook.com, and we'll send you to that landing page. That page is not only going to be about the book, but it will be an interactive website where we are going to be asking for your input on ideas, what resonates you, what doesn't resonate. If you have any stories around psychedelic experiences that you or your family members have been through, we want that as well on there. But that will all be to come, and we'll get together on our next round. And really happy to have you guys here this time.
Come to the conversation. Thank you.